I think what we need to do is to think anew about what it would mean to construct an inclusive patriotism that obviously treats minorities as equals, includes them in the nation, but that emphasizes what unites us across racial and religious lines, rather than just emphasizing what separates us. And part of that has to be a real civic patriotism. I think that we have to once again recognize how important the task of turning children into citizens is. That we can't just sneer about American history, and we can't just sneer about the Constitution, and we can't just sneer about American symbols. We need to actually defend them. We need to explain them. We need to say why, for all of its flaws, there's something special about the United States that we want to defend.
Welcome to Uprising. Each episode looks inside what it takes to lead the most dynamic and successful cultural movements. Some of them in the business world, some in the social realm, some in politics, and some in between, to see why people start uprisings. What gives those initiatives momentum and keeps them going? And most important, what lessons can you learn from these movements and how to apply them to your business and even personal life? Let's explore the secret to sparking movements that move people into action.
Passionate ideas.
Controversial ideas.
Uprising ideas.
The power is now in the hands of anyone.
To start a cultural movement.
Today's Uprising Pod is brought to you by warbyparker.com. Get a free 5-day home try-on at www.warbyparkertrial.com/uprising. 5 pairs, 5 days, 100% free.
Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There was never a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. Those were the words of the second president of the United States, John Adams, from a letter he wrote in 1814. Ronald Reagan pointed to a similar idea when he quoted a Scottish philosopher back in 1964. He said, "A democracy is always temporary in nature. It simply cannot exist as a permanent form of government." In 2017, American democracy seems to be in danger. It seems to be on the edge, teetering. With Donald Trump in power, our government faces a tipping point. Our guest on this episode of the Uprising Pod is a renowned political theorist and lecturer at Harvard University. He's here today to talk about a growing movement that believes our democracy is weakening. Please welcome Yascha Mounk to the Uprising Pod. Yascha, let's start with a broad question. With everything going on in society, in politics, in the media, this onslaught daily, how do you feel about the world right now?
Well, I'm really worried about the world. I mean, one obvious thing to worry about is Donald Trump and the fact that the president of the United States now is somebody who has no respect for the most basic democratic rules and norms, who is copying the playbook of authoritarian populists very closely, and, who has had some setbacks. He's experienced, thankfully, some real resistance, but he's not quite as unpopular and quite as unsuccessful as his detractors sometimes like to think. So I'm still very concerned about the future of U.S. politics.
But Yascha, you believe the problem of politics go beyond Donald Trump. In recent articles, you said democracy itself and our attitudes towards it are weakening. What signs are there that a movement is underway?
There's sort of a few simple ways of thinking about that. One is to see whether most citizens give importance to living in a democracy. Another is to see whether they're open to authoritarian alternatives to democracy. And the third is to look at whether or not there are political actors who really don't accept the most basic rules of the game. Now, on the first and the second, we looked at a colleague called Roberto Stefan Foer at a set of opinion surveys done by what's called the World Values Survey, the most ambitious attempt to gauge public opinion around democracy and other issues around the world. And what we found was really quite striking. So in the United States, for example, over 2/3 of people born in the 1930s and 1940s say that it's crucial to live in a democracy, really important, 10 out of 10. Once you get to younger people, to millennials, less than 1/3 say that it's essential to live in a democracy. So it's a very rapid decline. Much higher numbers of people say that, you know what, actually democracy doesn't really work very well. And even when you look at straightforwardly authoritarian alternatives to democracy, like, say, army rule, that number has gone up a lot. It's small. I mean, a minority of people think that, thank God, but it's a number that's gone up quite a bit. So it used to be 1 in 16 Americans who said that army rule is a good system of government, and now it's 1 in 6.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg said the symbol of America is not the bald eagle as much as the pendulum. There are movements, and then of course there are counter movements, and there are riptides. Pendulum swings one way, and then it swings back the other way. Another lecturer from Harvard, Pauline Brown, told me once that the bigger the front, the bigger the back. There seems to be a lot of disillusionment in democracy happening with our younger generation. Why is this movement mainly happening within the millennial generation and younger?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, one is that we're learning in this political moment that people don't necessarily believe in democracy out of some deep idealism, but because it's delivered for people historically. It's made people very affluent, it's given them peace and so on. So in the United States, for example, from 1945 to 1960, the living standard of the average American doubled. From 1960 to 1985, it doubled again. And since 1985, it's essentially been stagnant. And young people have borne the brunt of that stagnation. It used to be that only about 10% of Americans by the age of 30 earned less than their parents had. Now, half of Americans aged 30 earn less than their parents had at the same age. So for half of Americans, the promise of the American dream hasn't really been fulfilled. And so it's not surprising that more young people are saying, well, you know what, I'm not really getting anything out of this political system. Why don't we try something new? And that's coupled with a second important development, which is that older Americans and older people around the world have some real experience of what it means to live under or to fight totalitarian regimes, right? I mean, they understand what fascism meant. They grew up in a time when communism was a live threat for the Soviet Union. And younger Americans, they're less attached to democracy in part because they don't really understand what the alternatives look like.
That's true. They don't know what alternatives look like. I was traveling last year through Eastern Europe, through the Czech Republic, through Austria, and I met a lot of young people who told me they actually were aspiring for communism. They look back fondly to the old Soviet Union, which I found fascinating. I guess that's a psychological trait in humans. We just look back in history with only the positives. Is this something new? In 1968 and 1969, it felt like our Western society was coming apart at the seams. But of course it rebounded and thrived again. How is today's movement different from earlier ones?
Well, one way in which it's different is that it has led to very, very different electoral results. I mean, in the 60s, there was definitely a lot of civic strife. It definitely felt like there was starting to be big social divisions. But the discontent with politics was not nearly as deep as it is now. For example, when Gallup first asked people whether they trusted politicians to do the right thing most of the time during the time of Watergate, so a couple of years after 1968, 1969, actually a majority of Americans said, yeah, by and large, politicians do try and do the right thing. I think we can trust them. And now it's a really small minority of Americans who think that. So there's deeper disenchantment, and in part as a result, there's different electoral results. Perhaps you had some figures like Donald Trump as governors over the course of American history. You had some of those in the 60s, but you never had a president of the United States who attacked the media in the extreme ways that Donald Trump does, who attacks judges in the extreme way that Donald Trump does, who seems to have so little grasp of public policy, and so on and so forth. So I think when you look at the voting behavior of citizens, and therefore who now has real power in our society, this moment looks very different from the 1960s.
Yeah, that's true. Both Trump and the technology onslaught has weakened the media. I mean, we've seen, how technology has devastated journalism, publishing, music, and other creative industries. So it's almost like Trump is a part of this massive revolution that's underway. I want to go back to the distrust of politicians for a second. It goes way beyond distrusting the president. People are not trusting anyone in Congress or even the justices of the Supreme Court. It seems like a movement of its own. Why is there such a growing distrust of the pillars of our society?
Yeah, I mean, there's the sort of slightly trolling poll that shows that more Americans at this point trust second-hand car salesmen than trust congressmen, and that in fact lice are more popular than congresses. So, certainly there's very deep front of distrust, and I think there's a few reasons for that. I mean, one is again that politicians haven't delivered. That people used to feel, I don't know that I like politicians, I know that I completely trust them, but you know what? They've stuck to their end of a deal, so I guess it's all right. And at this point, I think they're saying, no, you know what? I really have no reason to trust politicians. I have no reason at all to think that we're doing the right thing because I don't see any improvements in my own life. So that's a big driver of this. I think they also feel more and more separated from politicians. As a lot of policy issues have become more technical, as they've required more and more international cooperation, I think they feel more and more left out of a loop on those important political decisions. And the third reason is just as important, and it's a little paradoxical. I think the more transparency we've had, the more mistrust we've had as a result. So, for example, when you had the WikiLeaks revelations, I was actually astounded by how little there was in those cables that was truly shocking or embarrassing. There's a little bit of good gossip. There was certainly a few real scandals, but on the whole, it showed a political system that was sort of surprisingly clean, cleaner than I would have expected before I saw those cables. But that's not how it's perceived. People say, well, these secret documents were released and there's scandals and so on. So, even when you have these forms of transparency and they actually reveal that the system is in certain ways sort of less messed up than one might think, the result is still for people to think, well, there's really bad things going on. And so all of those email revelations, all of those hacks and leaks and so on just drive a real mistrust of politics, even when what they contain isn't all that shocking.
This is Scott Goodson, and you're listening to the Uprising Pod. Today we are talking with Yascha Mounk from Harvard University about a new growing movement around the weakening of our democracy.
Well, there's been lots of times in history when people felt that technology was in fact weakening the political system or allowing extreme voices to rise, from the fascists who used the radio to various political movements that were supposedly emboldened by television. But I do think there's something different technologically about this political moment. Essentially, since the invention of a printing press, we've had a system of one-to-many communication. What I mean by that is that there was a set of people in a metropolitan center who had political power often, financial power often, who were able to have a lot of control over what kind of information gets spread. So this could be a big publishing house in the Renaissance, but it could be CNN or it could be NPR in the early 90s. In order to have your voice heard, you had to have access to these networks. Now, what happened first of all is the rise of the internet, which democratized one-to-many communication. Suddenly, for very little money, I could register a domain called yaschamounk.com, and everybody in the world could come and read the information I put out there. Now, it was still difficult for people to find me. It was easier for them to find the New York Times than it was for them to even know about my existence. So there's still some limits there. But then you had the rise of social media. And that affected the transition from sort of democratized one-to-many communication to what I call many-to-many communication. So suddenly, if you're on a United Airlines flight and you're, as we like to say, re-accommodated in a rather brutal fashion, and somebody takes a video of this, even if a guy taking the video only has 50 followers on Twitter, as long as 10% of their followers say, you know what, that's a really striking video, I'm going to retweet that. And as long as 10% of their followers say, you know what, that's really quite shocking, I'm going to retweet that, within an hour, millions of people can see that. And so the result of these two changes has been to undermine the power of gatekeepers at the center of our societies. The technological gap between political and financial elites and the rest of the population has shrunk. That is a good thing in many societies. It's a good thing in authoritarian countries where the democratic opposition suddenly has a much greater ability to compete with the government. And it's also had some good effects in our society. But it's also had some bad effects. It's also allowed hateful voices to have a greater voice. It's made it easier for fake news to spread. And so that's the world in which we now live. There's no longer gatekeepers who can control, what is acceptable in our political discourse.
That's true for all power brokers. I mean, top fashion editors aren't as important as the crowds. CEOs can't mandate change in your organization. You need a movement to inspire employees, to get them to buy in, to inspire creativity. The pyramid is upside down. But getting back to Trump for a moment, what I find interesting is that you were talking about the weakening of our democracy even before Trump became president. Now that he's in office, how is he a further threat to democracy? Or how does it affect our new generation, authority figures and established brands?
Well, in terms of the sort of attitudes that we measured, the jury is still out. We don't have new data on it. And I wonder whether it may have a slightly salutary effect in the sense that now that young people are seeing what it looks like to have a president with pretty anti-democratic attitudes, they may actually recommit themselves to the defense of the democratic system in certain ways. But at the same time, you have a president who is undermining norms of political operation that we desperately need for democracy to survive. So I'm very worried about the damage that he's going to do over the next still 3 years. I'm worried about his ability to undermine the impartiality of our elections. I'm worried about his ability to quell freedom of speech in some important respects. And I'm just worried about him destroying the kinds of informal safeguards we had against deeply corrupt government. So when you look, for example, at the way in which Donald Trump has just completely refused to disclose his potential conflicts of interest and has taken government action that stands to make him a lot of money, it's difficult to see how we get back to the kinds of standards of government accountability that Barack Obama's administration took very seriously, and honestly, every presidency before Barack Obama took very seriously.
That's a very good point. On top of all these negative effects of this movement, the weakening of democracy affects minorities and their rights most closely. This was best seen in the events of Charlottesville, of course, a few weeks ago. You're from Germany and you are Jewish. What was it like to see the violence that erupted at the University of Virginia?
Well, people often say that Germany has sort of dealt with its past so well. I think in some ways I was less shocked by Charlottesville than a lot of Americans, because I come from a country that actually, throughout its post-war history has had regular neo-Nazi marches. So I think I was a little less sort of surprised to see that a democratic society might have that. I don't think that the people who marched in Charlottesville represent more than a tiny fraction of Americans. And I think we do ourselves a disfavor if we hype them up by making it seem as though they spoke in the name of a large number of people. Now, what was shocking was the unwillingness and inability of the President of the United States to condemn those groups specifically and unambiguously. And that is something that was obviously incredibly upsetting and enraging. I don't think that means that Donald Trump has real sympathy for the neo-Nazis, by the way. I think it just means that he's unwilling to disown anybody who he sees as, a potential supporter of his cause, which is a very grave moral failing, and one which frankly is reason enough for any decent Republican to want to distance himself from him and frankly not cooperate with him. But I don't think it means that, the ideology of those neo-Nazis is now mainstream in American politics. I think it would be a mistake to read it that way.
For you, the listeners of Scott Goodson's Uprising Pod, Warby Parker is offering a free 5-day home try-on to give you the opportunity to check out their glasses. To get your home try-on today, go to warbyparkertrial.com/uprising. Again, that's warbyparkertrial.com/uprising for your free 5-day home try-on.
Another staple moment in this movement is Trump's reaction to the NFL players kneeling during the national anthem. He's taken to Twitter to voice his outrage, and Vice President Pence is even walking out of stadiums. No president has reacted to a form of peaceful protest like this before. What is the impact of this on our society and democracy? What movements can we expect coming out of this? Does it create fear, or does it embolden people to stand up more?
Well, I think it's one of the very clean and horrifying breaks with democratic rules and norms. I mean, the president is calling for private organizations to punish their employees for exercising free speech. And that, in my mind, is a clear violation of the very, very important principle that people should be allowed to express their political views, even if they're unpopular, and that the executive is supposed to protect rather than undermine that principle. Now, I want to add an important thing here, because I think there's been a broad and confused and contentious debate about free speech for the past year. And I think we have something to answer for here on the left as well, which is to say that a lot of bad people have invoked free speech over the past year in order to excuse quite horrifying utterances. But we have also not taken seriously enough our own tendency to shut people up when we don't agree with them. To me, this is an incident where absolutely we need to stand up to the president's outrageous behavior and outrageous attacks on the NFL players. But we also need to recognize that this implies a broader, more robust understanding of freedom of speech that then applies in situations where we might be a little less comfortable as well.
You mentioned Trump forcing private companies to punish these players. So what role should companies play in this movement as our democracy weakens? Should they stick their heads in the sand or stand for their stakeholders? How will that reflect on those companies in 2 or 5 or 10 years from now? Well,
the instinct of companies is both to be uncontroversial, to accommodate themselves to power, and to think about the short term. In a previous incarnation, I was briefly a management consultant in a firm that prides itself in working on strategy. And I learned, to my surprise and horror, that what we mean by strategy is really the next 3 years, as opposed to the next 2 months. So companies think, how can we make sure that we don't piss anybody off? And so then they're, very tempted to not criticize Donald Trump too much, not get in the crosshairs of an executive that might abuse its power. But I think that companies have self-interest if they're a little bit more reflective about the future of a country in standing up to these abuses. Because American companies have been so successful because we've had the rule of law. We've had checks and balances. We've had a system in which the political favor of a president does not make or break a company. And I think the kinds of things that the president is now doing are undermining those things. So American companies and the American economy is going to suffer greatly. And that gives companies a real self-interest, a collective self-interest in standing up to Donald Trump. And by the way, I would also argue that it's their moral duty, but they may be less responsive to that consideration.
Yascha, with this movement well underway, where do you see it going from here? What are the possible outcomes?
I think that the outcome is genuinely open. I think there is an optimistic scenario in which Americans recognize to what degree democracy is in danger, in which they recognize how much damage the Trump presidency is doing to America and to the world, and in which they rise up, as the name of your excellent podcast suggests, and oppose the president in a really robust way. Get him thrown out of office in 2020 and never make that mistake again. I also think, though, that there's more pessimistic scenarios. The most extreme would be Trump actually undermining the ability of the opposition to oust him from power in free and fair elections, in the kind of way in which Recep Erdogan has done in Turkey, in the kind of way in which Viktor Orban has done in Hungary. That is a scary possibility. I don't think that's so likely either. I think the most likely is what I call the Roman scenario. That, like in the late Roman Republic, you have this populist who breaks with democratic norms, who incites divisions in the population, and he does real damage to the institutions. And then he's defeated eventually, and politics returns to looking pretty normal for 10 or 20 years. But the underlying structural problems, the stagnation of living standards, the lack of a common identity among Americans, are unsolved. And so time and again, you get a return of similar kinds of populists, and over the course of the next 30 or 40 years, we slowly lose our ability to rule ourselves. We slowly lose what it means to have a free republic. And that's what most worries me about this. And I would say, because I imagine that all of the listeners to this podcast are people who are obviously politically active, who care about these things, that we're going to need a lot of stamina. That it's obviously a question of opposing Donald Trump today, of opposing the abuses of government that he's perpetrating. But it's also a matter of thoughtfully and carefully arguing for the kind of political action that can renew our democracy for the coming decades. So we should be into this fight for the long haul.
So this is the point in the Uprising Pod where we're looking for that sort of insight to inspire those movement listeners that are out there. What do we need to do exactly to start a counter movement that reinforces the ideals of democracy?
I think there's a movement now to oppose violations of democracy, and that's a good start. But I think one of the things that we should do beyond that is to remember that we have to be for something rather than against something. There's a real question about what will bind us together as Americans. On the right, on the far right, there's white nationalism. There's people who say what it is to be American is to be white. And we do have a common identity that's rooted in that ethnicity and so on. We're going to exclude everybody else. That's a very powerful ideology, and we have to think about how to win against it. Our instinct, and it's my instinct, for various reasons, has been to abandon the field of a nation, to say that actually our countries are problematic in all kinds of ways, they have these problematic histories, nationalism is dangerous, it can easily turn xenophobic, it can easily turn intolerant. So let's just think about the sins of our nation, and let's just frame everything in terms of the rights and the interests of minority groups. And I think that's a mistake as well, because it's allowed the right to conquer this really potent force of nationalism, and it's gotten Donald Trump elected.
This is all such great and powerful information and empowering information and ideas. Where can listeners go to get more information about you and about this movement?
So please subscribe to my podcast, which is called The Good Fight. You can find it on Panoply, which is Slate's podcast network. And please look out for my column in Slate as well. It's a weekly column, also called The Good Fight. And finally, I've just finished a book that I'm really proud of. It's called The People versus Democracy: Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. It's not out yet, but you can go to Amazon or another company and pre-order it. And I promise that it lays out not only a sort of broad analysis of the threat to our democracy in the United States and beyond, but also some of the ways that we can fight back against it.
You've been listening to the Uprising Pod with Scott Goodson. I would just like to say a great thank you so much, Yascha. This has been really, really inspiring.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on the Uprising Pod today. If you want to find out more about our guests or learn how to create your own movement, please go to scottgoodsonsuprising.com. You can also download the show from iTunes or where other podcasts are curated. The Uprising Pod is executive produced by Frank Olito, produced by Nicola Keneally, and edited by Russell Costanzo. With special help from Melanie Boardman, Karin Drachenberg, Philippa Freeman, Brianna Campbell, Farshad Faroudi, Mark Bruzy, Mark Issam, and Jonathan Weeks. My name is Scott Goodson, and you've been listening to the Uprising Pod, where we can learn about movements and uprisings that are shaping our world, in business, in society, and in between. For more on cultural movements and movement marketing, be sure to pick up a copy of the best-selling book Uprising: How to Build a Brand and Change the World by Sparking Cultural Movements, available on Amazon.com. If you have a moment, please do give us a favorable review on iTunes so that our movement moves up the ranks of the iTunes podcast list. And if you have ideas for future shows, please let us know by going to scottgoodsonsuprising.com. Thank you, and speak to you soon.